Good afternoon. You are with us on DD India. We are continuing coverage on Afghanistan crisis as it is unfolding there. For now, we are joined by Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Foreign Affairs expert. Mr. Chaulia, welcome to our broadcast. So as the humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Afghanistan, well, first up, could you please shed some light on the background of the Taliban? How has it come into limelight once again? How do you see it?
Well, the Taliban originated way back in the 1990s in the madrasas and the refugee camps in Pakistan. They were the children of the orphans of the what was called the Afghan civil war. Large numbers had crossed the Durand line. And then with the support of the Pakistani intelligence and the military establishment, they returned to Afghanistan and promised law and order and to clean up all the corruption and to stop the infighting among all the Mujahideen factions. So initially they were welcomed actually in 1996 by many ordinary Afghans. But once they captured power, they implemented very harsh, extreme jihadist ideology as a state policy. And they alienated a lot of minorities because the Taliban are primarily Pashtun. So now, 1996 to 2001, they were in power. Then they also had major alliances with global terrorist groups, including Arabs, who had fought alongside them in the 1980s and the 1990s in the anti-Soviet jihad. One of them, of course, was Osama bin Laden. So they sheltered Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda used the Afghanistan soil as for a safe haven to plot the, earth-shaking 2001 September 11 attacks in New York and Washington. And subsequently, the US invaded and overthrew Taliban, and Taliban for the last 20 years have been fighting guerrilla warfare to try and come back to power. And this is their moment. They have, unexpectedly made rapid offensive sweep across the country and have gained almost total control. None of us could really predict it. US intelligence failed to see it coming. NATO leaders, even none of the regional countries expected that they would be so swiftly able to capture power all at once. People were expecting civil war or long extended conflict, but it didn't happen, I think, because of governance flaws and failures with the Ashraf Ghani, the previous democratically elected regimes. And I think the ethnic factions also deserted the central government at the end. A lot of the warlords, they either escaped or switched loyalties to Taliban. So I would say that it was a grand failure of US nation building in the last 20 years that has enabled Taliban to stage a comeback and now to be able to call the shots and potentially re-establish their so-called Islamic Emirate. We would prefer that they adopt a more moderate position, both domestically and in foreign policy, but the track record of Taliban is not very encouraging. So a lot of pressure from within the Afghan people. Ramesh was just mentioning how the news media, urban residents, youth, all these are new developments in Afghanistan. They came about only in the last 20 years, post-Taliban rule. So they will try to resist in some non-violent way or the other. And international community must also, like you were talking about the UN Security Council and others, we must impose conditionalities. We must ensure that basic rights of women, minorities are respected within Afghanistan. And also it doesn't become a haven once again to carry out terror attacks. The US has washed its hands of the problem now. They are only concerned about the lives of American citizens.
Yes.
The way they are evacuating and prioritizing their own lives. It's clear that they don't care for Afghan lives or for the region much. So it's an abandonment. So we have to take charge now. It's our fate is now resting our national security, India's national security, security of all the neighboring countries like Iran, Central Asian countries, Russia, China, even Pakistan. They should not be celebrating right now, thinking that their proxies have again recaptured Kabul, because it will come back to bite them, because this jihadist monster, once you unleash it, it's very difficult to control it. So it's very important that the region should act in concert now. And of course, major powers, international powers should also play some responsible role. I think the US, despite withdrawal, it is facing a lot of rebuke and a lot of humiliation right now. And if Biden administration wants to prove that they want to show some leadership or some responsibility, they should steer Security Council and General Assembly at the UN, and to bring international community together and apply some pressure on Taliban. I don't mean war or fighting again, because people are tired of fighting of last 40 years almost continuously in Afghanistan, but through other means, through financial incentives or sanctions, recognition, a seat at the table, trade. There are a lot of things. The post-war reconstruction, most of the country has been devastated by fighting for 4 decades, and the standard of living is very low. Mass youth unemployment. You see, one of the reasons people are fleeing is not only out of fear of Taliban, but there has been a steady outflow of youth from Afghanistan all the way to Europe via Middle East for the last 10-15 years, taking the dangerous human smuggling routes and all that. People have had no hope, and that's why the earlier government fell. And with Taliban, one cannot be at all hopeful, but nonetheless, with external involvement, I believe constructively and collectively, we can at least give some hope of restoration of order, and potentially in the long run, restoration of democracy, although right now that looks very, very far-fetched dream.
Yes, so Professor Sreeram, next talking about from India's point of view, what happens to India's considerable economic investments in Afghanistan? Of course, we have helped them in building their parliament building, a dam, and so what happens to that?
Well, it's a tragedy in the sense, we are not even in control of our own infrastructure projects there. Our Ramesh was talking about the evacuations done by us today and yesterday to bring all our engineers and other technicians back, the ones who are operating many of the infrastructure projects there. We have done a lot. We spent over $3 billion US dollar equivalent in terms of development assistance and training and capacity building, and many of us have been involved personally to help build the state structures and to support nation building in Afghanistan for last 20 years. So all of it has now come to naught in many ways because of this, capitulation by the Afghan elites, the infighting among them, and of course the US abandonment. So I think we need to regroup, and we need to make sure that, for example, the Salma Dam, the Shahtut Dam, the big hydroelectric projects we have done, and such things, iconic ones, should remain functional. Let them be run by Taliban. What do we do now? They have anyway taken over the whole infrastructure of the country, and there is an incentive for Taliban to continue operating these, because otherwise there will be unrest in the society. As I said, people are not necessarily welcoming or very happy with their new rulers. So it is in the best interest of Taliban that hopefully our diplomats can go back with dignity and can operate there again. We should not be exiled permanently as long as Taliban is in power. I don't think we should try and repeat the 1996 to 2001. So I think we have opened some back channels. We are in touch with Taliban leadership, at least at the top level. We need guarantees. The Chinese and the Russians have got guarantees, and they have not evacuated. They have remained in Kabul, and their diplomat, the ambassador, is still there. Their staff are still there, and they're saying we are fine. So I think the Taliban is saying we want you to be neutral, quote unquote, or not to take sides. I think that's something that is being discussed. It's a sensitive subject, and we should recalibrate our strategy right now. Our developmental assistance should remain open depending on the attitude of Taliban. If they are willing to accommodate us, if they don't bring in terrorist groups that target our citizens like they did in the past, if they don't become proxies of the Pakistani ISI and the military, which deliberately have attacked and killed our citizens. We have lost many lives in Afghanistan, sacrificed blood, not just treasure there, through bombings and assassinations and kidnappings and such things in the past. So those cannot recur, no? And we need guarantees for that. Also, Sikh and Hindu minorities who are been facing ISIS, ethnic cleansing attacks, even if they are not Indian citizens, it's our moral responsibility to work for all of them. And I think we are trying to get them out as well if they want to. So I think overall, it is very grave, and we need to really count our blessings and just get out right now, which is the right thing to do, immediate thing, and then regroup with the rest of our regional partners and make sure that, as I said, there is sufficient pressure and maybe some inducements for Taliban to moderate themselves and not to repeat the mistakes that they did from 1996 to 2001. Because if they do that again, they will become a menace to the region, and they themselves cannot remain in power for too long.
Professor Sreeram Chaulia, why do you think China is supporting Afghanistan and calling it a friend? And of course, what are their commercial, geopolitical interests or economic interests?
China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, they have committed to more than $60 billion of investment in Pakistan, all the way up to the Afghan border, and they were hoping to actually extend it inside Afghanistan itself. But because of the very poor security conditions, they could not do it. So at one level, grand strategy, they may be wanting to extend the BRI, the CPEC, and to include Afghanistan in it, and to take it all the way beyond Central Asia to Europe. The Chinese are masters at building these, international corridors for connectivity, for trade and commerce. The other, of course, like Ramesh said, is the fear of the blowback of jihadist extremism into their own Xinjiang, into their backyard, and they will want to somehow insulate themselves from it. So they're probably looking at the so-called friendly relations they're talking about with Taliban as an insurance policy, or as a guarantee that their own citizens will not be attacked in Xinjiang because of the atrocities being committed against the Uyghur Muslim minorities by the party. So in that sense, Chinese have stakes. And probably there is one theory, especially in the West, in the US, people are talking about that now that the US is out of the picture and has basically, fled, then the Chinese will come in and fill the vacuum. I don't buy that, because China is not does not have the wherewithal to really invest in terms of military involvement and control and support of Taliban in Afghanistan. It's still primarily an economic beast, the Chinese expansion. They do use the military in Asia, in the Southeast Asia and East Asia and in South Asia against the direct neighbors. So we will have to see if they will try to expand it into Afghanistan also as a security. There are Chinese personnel inside Pakistan posted to protect their CPEC projects. So then they will have to extend it ultimately, but the risk is great. They have recently lost Chinese citizens to jihadist attacks in Pakistan on the Dasu hydroelectric power project, which is very close to the Afghan border inside on the Pakistani side. So there have been a lot of attacks against Chinese citizens who are doing this project because of the hatred of Chinese for what they are doing in to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So it's a very tricky situation for them, and I think they have been given assurances by Pakistan that we'll take care of your interests, don't worry, we will make sure Taliban will not go against you and all that. But Taliban themselves are now coming into power. We have to see how independent they will be from their Pakistani former masters and how autonomous they will be, because now they are running a nation state which has got actually a border conflict with Pakistan, right? So in the past, of course, they worked closely with Pakistan in the name of religious brotherhood and fraternity for jihad and all that. But we have to see whether there can be even a schism between Pakistan and Afghanistan. These things can happen. That may put complete spoil sport to the Chinese grand strategy of trying to dominate this region through mixture of commerce and aid and loans and infrastructure projects.
And Professor Sreeram, would you agree that this rapid advancement of Taliban in the major cities, now the capital, is because of the logistic support being provided by Pakistan?
Well, there are reports, credible reports, that thousands of Pakistani citizens or nationals have aided the Taliban offensive, especially in the eastern and southern Afghanistan, the last few weeks to capture power. So some of these are so-called the Pakistani Taliban, and some could be irregulars of the Pakistan military and ISI who have also joined hands because they have old connections with them. So we'll have to, wait for more intelligence on this as to the presence of foreign fighters. Amrullah Saleh and others who in the former Ashraf Ghani administration were saying that the large number of Pakistanis and also foreign fighter Arabs, Chechens, and from other parts of the world had converged and joined hands with Taliban in this offensive. The way they went to Syria and Iraq to join hands with ISIS and to overthrow set up a so-called caliphate there in 2014. So this idea of Afghanistan as a magnet or some kind of a jihad central, which will attract hardline extreme fundamentalists from around the world to come there and to converge there and to fight there and to believe that in Urdu they say like sawab ka kaam hai, something that will give them a place in paradise. They have these myths, very very well entrenched myths. So that is in fact the real fear, right? If the Pakistanis are already there in large numbers, last year also 2020 the United Nations report had shown that there are at least 1,000 fighters of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed training along with Taliban inside Afghanistan in camps. So Pakistani fighters in the past have come there, have operated there, and that is where I think we, as I said, for us the threat is there, because the Pakistanis, they cannot really challenge India in Kashmir or in conventional. So they look for these kind of tactics to try and bleed us to death, as General Ziaul Haq used to say, through these so-called jihadists and proxies. So Pakistani presence and influence in this new Afghanistan is something, it's a very critical factor, and it was one of the main reasons why we have supported the Afghan state and the moderate forces in Afghanistan in the past. And we have to maintain all those ties. I mean, so while we have to talk to Taliban, I think, and we are, on the other hand, we have to also make sure that there is some kind of balance and it doesn't become a backyard for Pakistan from which they can stage attacks against us. So it's a very delicate balancing act. It's a very big national security challenge going forward for Narendra Modi government.
Yes, it's a national security challenge for the whole of the region and the world. And Professor Sreeram, would you like to shed some light on how the media will be treated, world media will be treated in Afghanistan in this transition period? And of course, how do you see it in the future? Can we expect free reportage from that country?
Well, last time, 96 to 2001, it was largely a blackout.
Yes.
But one thing the Taliban have done in recent decades, I would say last 10, 15 years, even when they were in the bush and in the mountains as guerrillas, they developed a very savvy PR machine. And they had spokespersons who would be frequently in contact with Western journalists and give them interviews and try and, project themselves in a more positive light. So they have understood that, now in the 21st century, the warfare, there is psychological warfare and information, it plays a very central role in shaping public perception and all that. So my sense is that they're going to adapt, and it will not be as harsh or as discriminatory towards the media as in the past. But of course, they will not want any human rights abuses to be covered, and they will then claim that this is, an affront to the Islamic Emirate, and that these people were criminals and offenders as per the Sharia, and we are just giving them legal punishment and all that. So they do know that international media will focus on women's rights, on minorities and so on. So girls' education, for example, these are like touchstone issues that can get the whole world worked up and can lead to a ton of sanctions. Imagine if there is a massive set of Western sanctions on this new regime. Of course, they may hope that the Chinese will bail them out and all that. But frankly, I mean, you look at many countries that are under Western sanctions, even now, because of the US's dominance on the dollar-denominated system, it affects trade and financial flows and can really cripple a country. We saw that with Venezuela and Cuba and other countries in Latin America, also in the Middle East, a number of them. So I think they would be better off not to expel foreign journalists. In fact, there is also threat of other groups. I mean, now you see, even the Taliban have gotten control. There is so-called ISIS that is operating independently of Taliban, and there are other, Al-Qaeda and other groups who may use this interim period of chaos or re-establishment of order between now and there is no policing anywhere. The crime could become rampant, and kidnappings for ransom and such things are not unheard of in Afghanistan. In the past, foreign journalists have been abducted or taken into Pakistan to the other side, where nobody can even trace them because they may be linked to the ISI and the military. So there are threats. The most famous case of Daniel Pearl, the
Yes, yes.
Wall Street Journal bureau chief who was kidnapped and killed in Pakistan
Yes.
or on the Afghan-Pakistan border. So there are such threats. I think journalists, Indian journalists also, we should be very, very cautious. You know what happened to Danish Siddiqui, our own citizen,
Yes.
just a few weeks ago,
Yes.
when he was covering for Reuters.
Yes.
And so I think it's very important that, life is much more precious than coverage, frankly, at this time. And
Yes.
we must be absolutely cautious. But I think we have to negotiate these things with Taliban, because if Taliban really care about image and they want to bring in investments and they want reconstruction and such things, they better provide for the safety and security and give guarantees for foreign journalists to be here, because otherwise what will happen is they will not be able to really emerge out of the long economic decline of Afghanistan. No, it's so bad that ultimately they cannot just shore it up by talking of Sharia law or forcing people to grow beards or go to mosque 5 times a day. That is not going to solve the people's problems. So ultimately, once they start governing, I believe that they will need the outside world, and that is the opportunity for us to coax and to apply some pressures also and threats, and to bring them around to respecting press freedoms at least to an extent. Obviously it's a dictatorship. It's not an elected process. They don't believe in democracy.
Yes.
So obviously the press freedoms will be restricted, but minimum presence should be there on the ground, and that will also act as a check. But it's also an opportunity for Taliban to showcase, because they're saying they are going to bring peace and prosperity to the country after 40 years of war. Then they need somebody to document it and to show it to the world, and which will get a positive attention. I'm giving the best case scenario, but we know Taliban, and we should not have very high expectations. But this should be our expectation to our strategy to try and bring them to some kind of moderate position on all these issues.
Right, and interesting that you talked about the economic decline of Afghanistan. How is Taliban seeing the economics of it? How are they expecting huge sums of money to come to them to run this government? How do you see it? Taliban is very confident. Of course, it's projecting itself as a very different Taliban. They want to win the trust of the people. But what about the economics?
See, they're very simplistic. They often say corruption was the reason for the, fall and the decline of the living standards. And they often say that the puppet regime, what they used to call the, Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai governments of last 20 years, they say these puppet regimes were all corrupt, and they were being run by foreigners and by Americans, and that's why we could not grow. And they say we are going to clamp down on corruption, in a very harsh way, and give exemplary punishments and all these things to corrupt bureaucrats and administrators. So they are claiming that they will improve governance. Although 96 to 2001, there was not much improvement in governance. In fact, there was terror. People were terrified, and frankly, they were not really reformers. But they have been saying that, we need to root out corruption. Maybe some domestic changes, basic services, for example, now all the provinces and the urban centers they have occupied in the last 3-4 weeks. Now the demand is no electricity, no water supply, no police, no traffic regulation. Nothing is working in these urban centers. So to restore all those, they will need to bring external help. Now, possibly they are hoping that the Chinese will do it for them as part of the extended Belt and Road Initiative. And but as I said, they cannot really guarantee zero attacks on Chinese citizens by jihadis. I mean, that's something they cannot also control fully, because there are other factions and so on. So apart from China, maybe Qatar and Turkey. Turkey anyway is economically itself in a very steep decline, but Qatar has got money and oil wealth, and Qatar has historically sponsored Taliban political leadership. The so-called peace process, which has now been torn to shreds, was happening in Qatar. So they have got the gas money, and so maybe they are going to look at Qatar and China as their saviors, and try to work with them and try to have basic macroeconomic balance. But I must tell you, at the end of the day, they don't really have technocrats or any capable administrators in their own ranks.
Yes.
So if they don't retain the old structure, if they try to destroy everything and say we'll completely build a so-called Islamic emirate with only mullahs running the
Yes.
show, it will
Yes.
be a disaster. It will be a complete collapse. There will be no macroeconomic future whatsoever.
Yes.
So they ought to, encourage to continuity of the state structures, so that at least some capable people who may not be corrupt should be retained, even if they are not pro-Talib or pro-hardline Islam. So I think that is where they have to show magnanimity in victory. If they don't, they are going to squander this chance. And I can tell you, they have tasted defeat and suffering many times, Taliban, and they'll be up for more defeats in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Sreeram Chaulia, for joining us and giving us your valuable insights on how this crisis is unfolding. Situation remains grim, and the world watches with bated breath how this human rights crisis is going to unfold in the next 48 hours.